avait quelqu'un qui a dit que je peux pas jouer aux poupées, et après j'ai pleuré.
Welcome to Papatriarcha, the podcast that reflects on parenthood in the 21st century by trying to free it from the patriarchal model. Welcome to this new episode of my podcast Papatriarcha. I'm your host, Cedric, and today we have a special guest, Peter Gray, who is going to share with us some fascinating research on parental or other involvement and, more largely, adult involvement on our children. Peter Gray is a developmental psychologist and research director at Boston College. After receiving his PhD in biology from Rockefeller University in 1972, he was a professor in Department of Psychology at Boston College from 1972 to 2002. He is known for his criticism of the traditional education system and is regularly invited to speak to groups of parents, educators, and researchers. He opposes the current methods of education which, according to him, inflict psychological damage on children. I warmly recommend his books Free to Learn, which has just been released in paperback format in France. It has been a basis for me to understand and apply free and autonomous learning for my daughter in homeschooling. In this episode, titled Let Kids Play Alone, we're going to discuss an article co-authored by Peter Gray that explores the inhibiting effect of parents on their children, even in the absence of explicit instruction. We will also discuss the detrimental effect of constant monitoring and lack of freedom in children's development. We will discuss changes observed over the decades, including a continued decline in children's freedom to play independently and be responsible for their actions. The evolution of the way children go to school, for example, or the evolution of the part-time job they can do. We will discuss the impact of these changes on the mental well-being of children and adolescents. All of these activities will be referred in this episode as independent activities. Finally, Peter Gray will propose solutions to encourage independent play and socialization for children in their neighborhood. He will share with us success stories where neighbors have come together to organize outdoor playtime, allowing children to make real friends and have enriching experience alone. Let's start right away with this first question. Peter Gray, can you explain to us in a few words what the well-being of children is and, more importantly, why it is important? I wish you a good listening.
Children's well-being, of course, means that children are happy, that children feel satisfied with life, that children are not depressed or overly anxious, that, this, and of course it's important just because if we care about people, that we want everybody to be mentally healthy. It's very sad when anybody is feeling depressed or anxious or feels like life isn't worth living, and it's especially terrible when this is happening with children.
Your research suggests that the decline in independent activity among children is a major cause of their declining mental well-being. Can you just first explain us what you mean by independent activity?
So I should explain at the outset that my research and most of the research I summarize in the articles I've written has been done in the United States. So not everything that I say here may be quite as true in France as it is in the United States, but I know that much of Europe is taking kind of the same course as the U.S. has been. So you may be a little behind us on some of this, but you may be on that trajectory of over-control of children, of bit too much focus on schooling, not enough focus on children's own independent activity, their needs to play, their needs to do things that are separate from, that don't require adult control. So the focus of the research that I've been writing about is that in the United States, and I know that to a degree this is true in much of Europe also, over the past several decades, really over the past 50 years or so, there has been a continuous decline in children's freedom to play independently of adult control, to do things, to travel independently, to go out bicycling on their own or travel on public transportation without some adult watching them and guiding them all the time. even a decline as children get a little bit older into their early teens in their ability to have a part-time job. All of these kinds of things that represent a kind of trust of the child to be able to be responsible to do things on their own without an adult constantly supervising them, telling them what to do, correcting them all the time. It's been well documented in the United States that over the past really 50 or 60, maybe even 70 years, there's been a continuous decline in children's freedom in this sense, such that today in the United States, children no longer walk to school. Even children who are 10 or 11 years old are not allowed to walk to school. Whereas when I was a child many decades ago, 5-year-olds regularly walked to school. You walked to kindergarten. After the first day, your mom might have shown you the way, but after that, you walked yourself. I could ride a bicycle pretty much anywhere by the time I was 5 or 6. That has drastically changed. And so over this same period of time that we've had this gradual decline in children's freedom to do things on their own, we've seen a gradual but overall huge increase in anxiety, in depression, and even very tragically, even suicide among school-age children. Suicide rates were essentially negligible among school-age children and teens decades ago. Now it's a big thing. So the question is there a relationship between this decline in children's freedom and the increase in mental disorder among children, anxiety, depression, suicide? So a recent article that my colleagues and I published in the Journal of Pediatrics, we bring together converging multiple lines of evidence to support the view that there is a cause-effect relationship here. This may not be the only cause, but I think it's probably the major cause. That as you take freedom away from children, as you increasingly put them under other people's control where they're constantly being micromanaged, they lose their zest for life. They become depressed. They become anxious because they become fearful. The adults' fears translate into the children's fears. They become fearful that it's so dangerous because everybody's acting as if it's so dangerous. And they develop the view that they are kind of helpless in this world. They always kind of need help. And if you feel like you're helpless, then no matter what your age is, if you feel really helpless, there's nothing I can do if something were to happen to me. I'm just completely helpless. That sets you up for anxiety and depression. So that's the thesis of the article that we wrote, and this is something that I've been bringing a lot of different lines of evidence towards.
That's fascinating. You said that independent activity declined in the last decades. How have you observed that opportunities for children to engage in independent activity have decreased? How did you observe that?
So there's a lot of different ways of looking at the evidence. So there was a book published a few years ago, actually about 10 years ago, by a sociologist named Markella Rutherford. And what she did was she looked at magazines for parents over the last 100 years. In the United States, one of the magazines is Parenting Magazine, another is Good Housekeeping. And these are widely read by parents, mostly by mothers. And they always include a lot of advice about children. There are letters from parents to child experts, and the experts answer the letters in the magazines. So what Rutherford did was to analyze these articles for the past 100 years. And what she found was that prior to about 1970 or so, or maybe even in the 70s, much of the advice had to do with how your child should be independent. Your child should be walking to school by a certain age. Your child should be allowed to travel on public transportation. And if your child's a little afraid to do that, encourage your child to do it. Teach your child how to do it. There seemed to be an understanding that independent activities for children is important. Beginning in the 1970s, but really accelerating in the 1980s, what Rutherford found is the advice began to change, and the expectation began to be that if you are not watching your child every minute, you're a negligent parent because it's so dangerous out there, your child is at risk. Now, of course, the reality is that there really has not been an increase in crime over this period of time. There's not been, and the same advice is going out. There's been some increase in traffic in some neighborhoods, but the relationship to traffic and how overprotective people are is not a very close relationship. It's so what has happened is we've changed our attitude about what it is to be a reasonable parent. The belief in the past was, kids need their space and time, and adults need their space and time, and every parent used to say, get out of the house. For one thing, at least in the United States, houses were smaller then; they're bigger now. People had more kids then than they do now. They didn't want their kids hanging around the house. Get out of the house was what every mom said, out of my hair. And so there were always kids outdoors. The birth rate was higher. That was part of why there were more kids outdoors. So you'd go outdoors and you'd find kids to play with. And there was no expectation that there'd be adults out there watching you or telling you how to play. This is really normal childhood. This is normal childhood not only in the United States in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, but throughout the world, throughout time, as far as we can tell. Normal childhood involved lots of time to be with other children, playing with other children, doing things with other children, in some cases working with other children, without a direct adult supervision of what you're doing. That's part of growing up. So that's one line of evidence, is that analysis. Another line of evidence, there's been surveys done both in the United States, but even more in Europe, actually, of what is called children's independent mobility, where the survey really asks parents, what do you give permission, license to your child to do? Can your child walk to school by themselves or with friends, or do you have to take them or send them by a school bus to school? Are they allowed to walk or bicycle to school themselves? Are they allowed to use public transportation themselves? And so there have been these surveys, and over time, in much of Europe and in the United States, more and more parents say, no, my child is not allowed to do that. So that's another index of independent activity. So I mentioned part-time jobs as one kind of independent activity. When I was a kid, I had a paper route when I might have been 11. I seem to remember I was 10, but maybe I was 11. I had a paper route. By the time I was 13, I was living in a city in Duluth, Minnesota. I had an after-school job working for a publishing company, making deliveries in the city of Duluth on foot or on bicycle, and cleaning up the shop afterwards. It was a real job. I was paid minimum wage, but I was paid for it. I had a sense of pride about that because here I was, 13 years old, and I had a real job. I felt like I'm employable. I'm not that afraid of the world because I know I can actually make money. And it gave me a sense of pride, a sense of independence. Well, nowadays, at least in the United States, children at that age can't get those kinds of jobs. And even older teenagers aren't generally allowed to get jobs. It's as if school is the whole thing for children. And in school, you're totally micromanaged. You're constantly being told what to do. You're constantly being supervised and directed. And so these are some of the independent activities that have very clearly declined or even disappeared for children growing up.
That's really interesting because from one hand we have the work for children that can be problematic too, and on the other hand it can be a source of independence too. And when I hear your story, I think that you must have felt very confident in yourself.
Yes, and I'm not by nature a really bold person, but
Yeah.
but being able to do these things and gradually increase doing them, sort of going from a paper route, which was very common among children, mowing people's lawns, all those kinds of things, the kids babysitting, even at that time, Even though I was a boy, I could babysit. I would be hired as a babysitter by families who knew me and knew the family. So there were lots of things that I could do that I had a little bit of, to be honest, a little bit of fear of, but it was good for me to do it and overcome that fear and develop confidence. So if I didn't have those abilities, I would probably grow up kind of afraid of the world, as children are growing up today. Because, I mean, here's the way. I'm an evolutionary psychologist, which means that I look at human behavior from the perspective of what our natural drives and instincts are. And one way of thinking about, why do we human beings have such a long period of childhood and adolescence before we grow up? It's because it takes time for us to acquire the kinds of skills and ability and confidence that it takes to become an independent adult. So the whole purpose from an evolutionary perspective of childhood is to become increasingly independent. As you grow older, you take on more and more tasks yourself without having to be helped in some direct way without having to have somebody standing over you telling you exactly how to do it, without having to be constantly feel like you need to be protected by some adult who's following you around all the time. This is part of growing up, and it has to occur kind of gradually. By age 4, there are certain things you could do that you couldn't do at age 3. By 6, there's more things you could do. By 10, there's still more things you could do. By the time you're a teenager, still more things to do. And then finally, you're an adult and you feel like I can now take responsibility for my life. I don't need to be protected by my parents in the same sense that a child is protected by their parents. So that's what we've destroyed, is that opportunity really to grow up by becoming increasingly independent as you are growing older.
What are the immediate effects of independent activity on children's happiness? Do they feel, we'll talk about confident, but what are the other effects immediately?
Yeah, so first of all, play itself is happiness, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's
that's okay.
that's what play is. It's play is when children are asked, and there actually are such studies, as if we needed such studies, right? I mean, there are such studies where you ask children what makes you happy, and you ask them to draw pictures. If they're young children, draw pictures of things that make you happy. And what they draw is pictures of playing, or they talk about playing. I mean, ask any child what makes you happy, and it's playing. Play makes you happy, right? Play is really doing what you enjoy doing what you want to do. And also, if you ask children about play, what you soon discover is that most children see play as something that they do themselves. If there's an adult directing it, if there's an adult saying, okay, now we're all going to play this, then children don't really see it as play, and it isn't really play. The way I define play and the way many other play researchers define play is activity that is initiated and directed by the players themselves, by the children themselves. If it's initiated and directed by somebody else, it's not really play. And children feel that way too. It's not really play if there's an adult there telling them how to do it or what to do it or correcting them if they're not doing it right, and so on and so forth. So play is what makes children happy. Play is independent activity. So that's part of it. So you take away play and you take away an immediate source of happiness, and immediately, measures of mental health go down, because if you're not happy, you're not mentally healthy. But in addition to that, play and other forms of independent activity build confidence. They build what researchers call an internal locus of control, the sense of, I can solve problems. I can do things on my own. I'm not just a victim of circumstance or powerful other people. I have power myself. I can do things. And that kind of confidence helps you face the bumps in the road of life. So you're outdoors and something goes wrong, and maybe people call you a bad name, they're teasing you or whatever it is. if you have this internal locus of control, this internal sense, this internal confidence, you don't necessarily fall apart because of that. But if you haven't developed this kind of confidence in yourself, this kind of sense of agency, then you become sort of and you see yourself as a victim, then every kind of thing that's negative in your experience, you begin to feel terrible about. You feel like, oh my gosh, people hate me, and life is not worth living, and so on and so forth. So play not only is an immediate source of happiness, but play and other forms of independent activity create psychological resilience, the ability to feel like I can manage life. I can manage the downs as well as the ups of life, and I will be okay.
When I hear you, what I understand about our parents' role is to let children play, let them succeed or let them down, but just to be here when they need us, not when we think they need us.
That's a very good way of putting it. That's right. Children, you want to be there when the child needs you, and you are a source of security for the child. You are somebody. You want to be somebody the child will go to. And one thing that I think is true, if you trust your child and if you allow your child to do the things that the child knows that they can do and that they want to do, your child is even more likely to come to you when they really do need you. If you're constantly in their face, then their goal is to avoid you, you know. But if you're not so constantly in their face and they realize that you respect them and respect their independence, then they are more likely when they really do need you to come and say, hey, you know, I've got this problem. Can you help me with it?
I wonder if this kind of overprotecting attitudes we can have is not a source of anxiety for us too, as parents, you know? Because in France, we speak a lot about being a parent is getting harder and harder, but maybe these attitudes are bad for ourselves too, you know?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, we've taken on such a burden when we think that we need to be everything to our children. You know, children, especially mothers in general, but fathers to some degree. Maybe in France, fathers play a bigger role than they do in the United States. I don't know. Fathers talk a lot about being better parents.
We try.
But they're not. They haven't really. It's still moms who do most of it in the United States, at least. And so moms kind of take on all of this burden. Like, it's not enough just to love your child and feed your child and shelter your child. You've also got to be your child's playmate. You've got to take your child everywhere. You've got to protect your child constantly. You've got to move that child wherever their child going. Otherwise, you feel like you're a bad parent if you're not constantly, you're supposed to be talking to your child all the time. It's as if the parents are the only social world for the child, maybe the parents and the teachers at school. And because we've kind of separated children off from the peer culture, and it's really throughout history, children are mostly talking with other children. That's how they learned it. They're mostly experiencing social life with other children. It's really other children who socialize children. It's not generally parents who do it. So the children are out, they have all these social experiences, they're learning, they're every day, they're interacting in ways that are helping them grow. And parents have nothing to do with that. But now there's less and less of that opportunity. And so parents feel like they have to be everything. They have to be the conversation partner for the child, the play partner for the child, the transportation for the child, because the child's not allowed to go by themselves anywhere. So it becomes a big burden. I'm not surprised. I wrote a blog post just a couple days ago in which the first line was, I'm not surprised that the birth rate is going down. You know, if I were a young woman, I said, and then I qualified it, said, I'm not a young woman, I'm an old man, but one can imagine, I would be very reluctant to give birth to a child because of all the burden that this is going to bring to my life. It's much more than giving birth and caring for the child for a few years and watching the child grow. It's like a 20-year burden, so, and it didn't used to be that.
I just love what you say. And I think it's important for the children and for the parents. So thank you. Thank you for saying everything you already said. In the article, you mentioned that high school students who hold part-time jobs feel more independent and happier. Can you explain why is the case? Because, okay, we spoke about the independent activities, but maybe they could feel sad because they have to work, maybe to earn money because the family situation is not good enough.
That's a good question. When, it was more than a century ago, really, that the United States and much of Europe decided that child labor should be abolished, full-time child labor. And that was a good decision. We had children were working in sweatshops, they were working in coal mines, young children had dangerous jobs, their life was constrained by labor. And it was very important to free children from that kind of labor. So in a certain sense, child labor developed a bad reputation. If you read Dickens or you read, the literature of the 19th century, so of course we wanted to free children from this kind of labor. And part of it was to enable children to go to school so that the same time that school became expected and even compulsory, we had to say that you couldn't have children in full-time labor because they needed to be freed for school was part of the whole thing. Of course, now school has become full-time labor for many children, and I know children who would rather work in a factory than go to school. So that's the irony of it. We freed children from full-time labor so they could go to school, and now we've made school a laborious, almost full-time thing. In fact, many children are spending more time in school and schoolwork than their parents are spending at their full-time job. And it's a tedious, sedentary, unhealthy job for children. That's what school is. So there is an irony there. But to get back to really what your question is that I think that many young people are looking for a balance. They don't want to work full time. It wouldn't be healthy for them to be working full time. What they want is some kind of work that gives them a sense of responsibility and also gives them their own money. This is when a child is earning their own money, that's different from when the parent is giving it to them. Because this is, I earned this, I made this money, and I can spend it however I want. My parents can't tell me how to spend this money. I made this money. I can save it if I want. I can buy candy if I want. I used to use my money, my paper route money, for buying fishing tackle. I was big into fishing at the time. And so it gives you this kind of sense of independence that, in addition, the job gives you social experiences that you otherwise might not have. The experience of if you're serving in a restaurant, of greeting customers and getting to know them. If you're, as I was, working for a printing shop, really getting to know adults who work there, what they're like, getting to know them as real people in the real world. So it gives you these kinds of social experiences, and it gives you a sense of responsibility. It gives you a sense of accomplishment, and gives you some money that is your own money. I think especially when it's the young person's own choice, it's a very valuable thing. If the young person feels forced to do it, that has sort of negative connotations. That's like being, none of us like to be forced to do something that most children are already being forced to go to school, and to go to school in certain ways and do certain kinds of things that they don't want to do. And if work becomes yet another thing that you're forced to do, it's sort of like a step towards enslavement rather than a feeling of independence and freedom. But if it's your choice, I want to do this, that's a very different story. There's not a lot of research, the psychological benefits of part-time work or the psychological handicaps of part-time work. The study that I referred to in the article that you mentioned is a a study that was done in Australia, and it was a pretty systematic study as far as I can tell. And what they found was that high school age students who had part-time work were happier than those who in other ways were similar group and less happy, and gave some of the reasons why, reasons that I've already kind of just touched on now.
You talk about the inhibiting effect of the presence of adults on children's play. What you already said is when an adult directs the play, it's not play, okay? But how does it work, this inhibiting effect? Can you tell us more about this, please?
So when adults, well, first of all, let me mention a couple of research studies that support this idea. So one study in the United States was a study in which researchers, this was some years ago, at a time when it was still possible to find children in parks who were not being supervised by adults. It was a study done in city parks, and they observed children in the park to see what they were doing in the park. And what they found was that when children were in the park with other children and no obvious adult supervisor, no adult there watching them, the children were much more active. They were physically more active. They were playing in physically more health-promoting ways because they were they'd be climbing trees, they'd be chasing one another around, they'd be doing the kinds of things that you might expect children in the park to do. Children of the same age, if there was an adult present, were far less likely to be that kind of physically active. They were far more likely to be passive, to be not playing in these vigorous kinds of ways. So that study concluded that just even if the parents are not obviously telling the children what to do, the parents have a dampening effect. It's as if the children think that the parents will tell them, you're not allowed to climb those trees, or stop running around so fast you'll fall and hurt yourself, or will think that something is bullying when it really isn't bullying. All of these kinds of things that even if the parents aren't actually interfering, because children are used to adults interfering, they expect they're going to interfere, and it dampens down what they're doing. So that's one study. Another study that was done in Zurich in the 1990s, in Zurich, Switzerland in the 1990s, was, I think, a very interesting study. So at this time, at least in Zurich, there were still neighborhoods where 5-year-olds could be found outdoors playing without adults out there watching them. So you'd go out, it was old-fashioned kind of play in the neighborhood. There were kids playing outdoors with other kids in the neighborhood. But there were other neighborhoods where, because of traffic, the children were not free to go outdoors and play on their own. But they were similar socioeconomically in other ways, but it was just that one group was in a neighborhood that kids were still free to go out and play in the neighborhood, the other group wasn't. The researchers were interested, what's the developmental effect on, and they chose to study 5-year-old, of living in one or the other of these two kinds of neighborhoods. And so what they found was that in the neighborhood where the children were not free to go outdoors, the parents believed they were compensating for that by taking the children frequently to the park. So the parents would take them to the park, where they would have a chance to play in the park. So they were outdoors, they were in the park, and this is like something you can do to compensate for the fact that your child is just not free to go out and play in the neighborhood. So what the researchers found is that the children who were free to play in the neighborhood, by every measure that they used, were doing better than the children whose parents took them frequently to the park but weren't free to play in the neighborhood. They had twice as many friends. They were socially more competent. They were physically more well-controlled. Every way you looked at them, they were doing better both physically and psychologically than the children who were regularly being taken to the park. And so then the researchers speculated, it wasn't just speculation, they actually had some data on why taking the children to the park doesn't compensate. And the first thing is, first of all, parents have limited time and patience. So you take the child to the park, and after a while, the parent says, okay, it's time to go home. So even though they believed they were compensated, the children were not outdoors nearly as much as the children who could play in the neighborhood. And children have much more patience, if you will, for being outdoors and playing, the much more desire to do it than parents do. Secondly, the play in the neighborhood was very qualitatively different from the play in the park. In the neighborhood, they were playing all the time with people that they knew. They developed friends, then they knew how to play, and they could also bring things outdoors. There were all kinds of things they could do. They could bring out equipment. They had their scooters. They had nails and hammers and boards if they wanted to do that. There were many ways they could play. In the park, they were much more limited. About all you could do was play on the playground equipment. There wasn't much else you could do. And the people there were a different group of kids every time, so you didn't get to make friends that way. And it takes time to know how to play with somebody in a real, playful, enjoyable kind of way. So play was qualitatively very different. You were less likely to end up making friends by doing this. You would see regularly. And there was much less variety of play. There was less opportunity for imaginative play, less opportunity for constructive play. About all you could do was swing on the swings and slide on the slide and dig in the sandbox, whatever was in the playground. So all of that made it not surprising that going to the park did not compensate for free neighborhood play. So that's some of the empirical evidence to support this point.
How and maybe what kind of societal changes in childcare contributed to declines in mental well-being?
I think there were a number of social changes. And again, I'm speaking primarily about the United States, where my evidence comes from. But I think, again, that much of the same is true in Europe. So one of the things that happened so the change really began to accelerate in the 1980s. That was really when children's lives began to become more and more restricted. It wasn't all at once, but it began earlier than that, but it really accelerated in the 1980s. So there were certain things in the United States that happened in the 1980s, and to some extent this might have been worldwide. One is that school began to become a much bigger deal than it was before. School became more oppressive, if you allow me to use that word, than it was before.
That's okay.
In the United States, there was a book published in 1980 based on the thesis that the United States was falling behind China in particular. We were worried about China was overtaking the United States in schooling, that their children were learning more than our children, and that this was a national risk. And the title of this book was A Nation at Risk. But it was really about, and it was a government-funded study and a government-supported book about the idea that because our school children were not studying and learning the way the Chinese children were, or some of the other Eastern European children were, that we were falling behind, and this actually was a security risk for the United States, if you could believe it. We've got this long history. There was a time earlier than that, back when I was in school, so you know how old I was, when we believed that the Russians were way ahead of us in education and we were falling behind. And so there was an encouragement to try to get all the boys to become engineers so we could develop rockets and so on and not fall behind the Russians. Well, by the 1980s, it was more the Chinese that we were afraid of. And the schooling system in China was better than ours, and they were outscoring us in international tests. Around that time, there began to be these international PISA tests, and the East Asians always scored higher than the Americans did. And so we had to do something about that. And so what happened was, prior to that, schools were pretty much run locally. Local school boards could make decisions about schooling. Teachers in the school had a lot of authority in their own classroom about what they did. And teachers generally are nice people, they like kids. That's why they become teachers. And so for the most part, schooling was kind of child-centered. I don't want to overstate that. In some ways it was terrible even then, but it was not so terrible because teachers kind of understood children need to get outdoors. There was a lot of recess. I remember teachers would say, I can see you're all kind of restless. Let's just take a break and run around, go outdoors. Teachers could adjust what they were teaching based on the children's interest to some degree, at least. They weren't held fast to a government-controlled curriculum. It depended to some degree on who you had as a teacher. Most teachers were nice people, but sometimes you might have a mean teacher, and then it was terrible. But beginning in the 1980s, basically the attitude was teachers can't be trusted. And so teachers have to be told exactly what they're going to teach. And teachers began to be evaluated based on the test scores that the children in the class were getting. So the teacher's job began to become to increase test scores. And so this drill about tests, which is the most boring possible thing that you could be doing, and recesses were cut down because of the belief that children needed to be spending more time doing worksheets and studying. There was almost no homework for children prior to about the 1970s. And then there began to be some homework for children in elementary school. Beginning in the 1980s, homework could greatly increase. So you had this phenomenon that children, even young children, were carrying books home and worksheets home. And so school didn't end when the school day ended. You went home and you did homework. And then with time, parents were expected to make sure their children did the homework. It was like you were being blamed as a parent if your child didn't do their homework, right? That was your fault. So this is more pressure on the parents. You'd get called in by the school if your child wasn't doing the homework and reminded that your child isn't doing the homework and that you might not be told in exactly this way, but the message was you're not doing your job as a parent by not sitting your child down and making them do the homework. So that changes the relationship between parent and child right there. That the parent now is a kind of assistant teacher, an enforcer of homework, and is supposed to help the child with homework in some ways. So now the parent isn't just a loving advocate for the child. The parent is also kind of an enforcer of school rules. So that played a big role. It changed the way parents think about parenting. It changed the amount of time that children have for freedom because they were spending more and more time on schoolwork. Also in the United States, the school, not only was recess taken away, but the school year increased. The school year is now 5 weeks longer. There's 4 weeks less of summer vacation, another week less of vacation during the school year away from school. So children are spending much more time in school and at schoolwork than they did before. And that began in the 1980s and has been increasing ever since. So that was one thing that happened. Another thing that happened in the United States is that there were a couple of very much publicized cases of young boys. There were 2 young boys in particular, 2 separate cases in the early 1980s, being snatched away on the street by strangers and ultimately murdered. So those cases were much publicized, in part because it's so rare. I mean, this is not something that happens regularly. It was news because it was rare. But they were so publicized and became such a big deal that everybody got this image. If my child is out there, this could happen to my child. My child might be snatched away. And so we developed what came to be called stranger danger, that strangers are dangerous, especially men, And so I began to feel like I used to earlier on, I could go and watch children in the park and so on. And suddenly I became suspect if I was there, a lone male watching children in the park. Why would I be interested in children in the park watching? It was part of my research, but I began to feel like I can't do this anymore. The whole attitude changed. Like strangers, instead of being kind of friendly people that you would ask for directions if you were lost and so on and so forth, they became people you're not supposed to talk to and you're supposed to be suspicious of. So that changed, and at the same time, there was a whole publicity campaign. They began to hear public service announcements in the United States on radio and television that went, do you know where your child is right now? And the implication was, if you don't know where your child is, that means you're a negligent parent. It didn't say it exactly that way, but that was the implication. So this attitude that you send your child outdoors and let the child free outdoors began really to seriously change in as early as the 1980s. And that momentum increased over time. So that was part of it. I think that there were other social changes that occurred. Among other things, we began to have fewer children. And so simply the number of children in any given neighborhood decreased. So the likelihood of you're just having friends in the neighborhood decreased. We also went into a world, for the most part, I would say much for the better, in which women were working outside of the home as well as men. And so there was often nobody at home during the day. And that also, I think, had the effect of making people think the neighborhood is less safe than it was before. In the past, children would be playing in the neighborhood, but there would be moms at home looking out the window, and kind of the sense, and everybody knew their neighbors partly because moms were home. So moms knew the other moms and as a reason, and the kids knew the other kids. And so there was a sense of, you know who your neighbors are, and you know your neighbors will rescue your kid if there's some problem and I don't happen to see it. So there's that kind of security of neighborhood. And I think we never figured out what to do about that once there was nobody home during the day. And people's friends were no longer their neighbors. Their friends were their work partners who might live in a whole different part of the city. And so you got to a world where for all you know, your neighbor might be a child molester, right? You don't know because you don't know your neighbors. So that also was part of it. And I would be the last person to say that it wasn't a good thing. I mean, women were in some sense slaves when they could have independent employment and make money themselves. They were dependent on men who in some cases were abusive. And so it was an important societal change, but we never figured out, at least in the United States, we didn't figure out, well, what are we going to do about the kids? We didn't take into that account. And then we had this phenomenon, the so-called latchkey kids who were coming home to nobody at home. And this began to be perceived as a problem. And so we began, what are we going to do about that? We have to have some way. We don't have a really good daycare system in the United States. We don't have really publicly funded kind of care. And so we began to think, well, what we've got to do is we've got to have children in school longer where there's adults. We have to also put them into adult-directed activities outside of school because we don't want them just at home. So we have all these adult-directed sports and classes and all kinds of other things that children go into, which we might call it play, but it's not play. It's all adult-directed. Children are micromanaged there much as they are in school. And so all of this happened. I guess what I'm saying is there were a variety of social changes that all came together. One further thing I might mention, in the United States, the 1980s marked a political divide here, political shift, where we went from a kind of progressive, liberal political attitude where we had fairly strong labor unions, we had a fairly progressive tax system that kept the gap between really rich and poor relatively small. I mean, it was big, but it wasn't, beginning when Ronald Reagan was elected president in the 1980s, and we suddenly had a different agenda that greatly decreased the taxes for the rich while not decreasing the taxes for the poor, doing away with much of the social services that were being provided by those taxes. The gap between rich and poor began to increase, and it's been increasing in the United States ever since. One thing we know, there's a lot of research that shows, cross-country research, that the bigger the gap between rich and poor, the more anxious parents are about their children. And the reason for that anxiety is clear, that when I was a kid, neither my dad or mom had gone to college. They were working class people, but they had decent jobs. My mom did work, even in the area where that many people work. I had a grandmother living at home who kind of minded us. But you could get a job. My dad was a union man. He got a decent salary because of the union, fair amount of job security, at least when he was at his union job. And I had uncles, a similar kind of thing. And so it was a world where you didn't worry that much about whether your children were going to make it or not. There was this kind of sense, as long as your children are decent people and they work hard, they'll be okay. But now it became, the homelessness began to increase in the United States, people falling out of what was the working class and middle class to sheer poverty as a result. And so you began to feel as a parent, I've got to make sure that my child goes to college, because we developed this attitude that if your child doesn't go to college, they'll never get a decent job in this new world. That was never really true. And there are a lot of people who go to college who still can't get decent jobs. But the belief began, you've got to go to college, and so that means you've got to do well in school. And so you've got to force the child to do school. That became the big priority, is doing well in school, developing the kind of resume that you need to get into college. And if you were kind of in the upper middle class, not only did you want your child to go to college, you wanted them to go to an expensive, fancy college, believing that they would be more employable if they went to Harvard than if they went to the local state college. So the pressure on parents to get their children to do well in school, and then the pressure on children to do well in school, resulted in this kind of pressure, which is really part of the source of the mental anxiety, the anxiety that children have, the fear of failure, which when I was a kid, you were not proud if you got an A. You were that was, it was something you tried to hide if you did well in school. And by now, if you do well, you feel really like you're a failure. Many children feel like they're a failure if they're not getting high grades in school. And that's part of the source of anxiety and depression and even suicide.
Okay, that's a lot of things. So, according to you, what are the main challenges to increasing opportunities for independent activity for children in our current society?
So, I think for an individual parent, for parents, the main challenge, I think, is to find safe enough ways for your child to have independent activity. What can you do to create opportunities for your child to be playing with other children? If you can't just send your child outdoors and there's other children out there, which is true mostly, it's not true everywhere in the United States. There are still neighborhoods where that happens. But for most parents, they can't do that. There's just no other children out there playing. And if they send their child outdoors, somebody might even report it to the police. There's a child out there without an adult, and police will come and make a visit. And if you're poor, there are even cases of children being taken away from parents because they were outdoors playing without an adult watching them. So this is a tragic situation. And so there's a lot of good reason why you just wouldn't do that. Send your child outdoors to play. And if there's nobody else to play with, the child wants to come back in, or they just get on their mobile phone and interact with other children that way, because it's the only way they can find friends. So you need to find some ways so maybe it involves getting to know the neighbors and who have children, getting together, talking about what can we do in our neighborhood to make some real neighborhood play possible. So maybe there'll be certain times in the week or on weekends when we'll all just send our kids out. We'll just say, get out of the house, stay in the neighborhood, and the other parents are also doing the same thing. If you make an agreement that. And if the parents feel like some parents feel still, even though there's a bunch of kids out, that it might not be safe. So let's have one parent, ideally a grandparent, not a parent, but ideally a grandparent, because grandparents tend to be a little more easygoing and less likely to intervene. who's out there just kind of for safety purposes, just to watch, not to intervene, not to tell the kids how to play, not to solve little problems, but just to be there for safety purposes. There are actually some places that have done this and where it works. So but it takes initiative. It takes somebody who's willing to get to know the neighbors, to talk to them, to convince them that this kind of play is really important. Let's make it possible. So that's one route to a solution that parents can do. Another route to solution is to work through the schools. So I'm one of the founders, along with Lenore Skenazy, who wrote a book called Free Range Kids, of an organization in the United States, a nonprofit called Let Grow. And we're working with schools to bring real free play into schools. So most schools aren't willing to do this during the school day, but many schools are willing to do it either before school or after school, where they open up the school playground, they open up the gymnasium, maybe even some rooms inside the school for free play, where all the children in the school are invited to play with other children. And there are sometimes as many as 150 kids. Elementary schools, so it's age 5 on through about 11, all playing together in an age-mixed way. And usually I talk to the principals of the school, or Lenore does, and we instruct them that during play club, if there are teachers monitoring it, they have to think not of themselves as teachers while they're monitoring play club. If they're just there for safety, like a lifeguard on an ocean beach, if somebody's life is in danger, step in. Otherwise, please refrain from stepping in. The purpose of play is for children to learn to solve the problems themselves. So this has been, it's still a small minority of schools doing it, but there are probably a few hundred schools doing this now, and we get very positive reports from it. The children, of course, love it. The parents are beginning to understand the value of it. Teachers are beginning to understand the value of it. The children are making more friends that they didn't have before. They're feeling better about the school because they've got friends at school that they didn't have before. They feel less afraid of the older kids if they're little kids, because they realize these older kids are really nice and are helpful to them, and so on and so forth. There's a much better sense about the school. The school atmosphere improves. And one thing we know is that children actually, when people feel better about school, they actually do better on schoolwork too. And so the teachers and the principal are happy about that. So this seems to work out very well for schools doing it. It's still not enough play, and most schools just do this for 1 hour a week if they do it. Some schools are beginning to do it more. I would love to see it happen every single day, where the school is just open for free play every day after school, between the time when the school day ends and parents are home from work. This would solve a lot of problems. This would provide lots of opportunities for free age-mixed play, all kinds of play possible, because you can play outdoors, you can play in the art room, you can play in the gymnasium, you can play with older kids, younger kids, always people that you could find who would make good playmates, because there's so many kids there and you see them every day. This to me would be a terrific solution for our times. I don't know any schools doing it that way yet, but it's a beginning, the fact that a good number of schools are doing it for at least an hour a week. So that's one kind of solution. Another thing that's happening in the United States is, and I don't know if this is happening in France or in Europe generally, but libraries are beginning to become places for play, interestingly. So libraries are publicly supported institutions. They are, by definition, educational institutions for self-directed education, because that's where you go to find books and to do research. But the traditional function of libraries, to be places where you borrow books and look up information, is no longer as needed as before, because we've all got technology. We can access most of what we want free without having to travel to the library to get it. And so, but libraries, like any organization, want to continue being relevant to the community, and so they're taking on other functions, including being general community centers in some ways. And some libraries are recognizing, so what is really needed in our community is a place for children to play. And so in various ways, libraries are beginning to become places for children to play, where they have play areas for young children. They have maybe a teenage hangout room for kids, teenagers who want a place to just talk with other kids and play video games, or even listen to music in this separate sort of teenage room after school that's kind of sound isolated from the rest of the library. And many libraries now have maker spaces in them. So these are areas where there's sort of high-tech equipment, laser cutters and 3D printers and so on. And they're available for children as well as for adults. And it turns out it's mostly children who come to use them and figure it out. And so this is a kind of constructive play. And librarians have learned we don't even have to learn how to use this equipment because the kids figure it out. And they have learned that they can trust the kids to do it. And this is a growing thing. Just within the last 10 years, many libraries have put in maker spaces. So these are places where kids can come and they can gather and they can work on these kinds of projects together, and this is a form of play. The biggest step towards library as a place to play that I know of, there's a particular library in Austin, Texas, and I got to know these librarians, and they actually did a research study with me of play in other libraries. But these librarians at this library created after-school play at the library, where they put up a big sign that says "Joyful Noise Welcome," and the kids can play inside the library and outside the library. For patrons who want quiet library space, there's a quiet room in the back of the library that's closed off, and they can go and use that. But kids are playing, and they've said that sometimes they'll have as many as 100 or 150 kids at the library playing. And when parents bring the kids, they tell the parents, so this is for the kids to play, and we've got a place for the parents who want to stay. You can be over here. We've got refreshments. You can talk to other parents. There are games you can play. But they're emphasizing, they understand that parents can kind of ruin the children's play, and they have this very gentle way of encouraging the parents to stay away from the kids, even their own kids who are playing. And this is working out really very well, and I'd love to see this spread further. So these are some potential solutions to the problem. We're probably not going to go back anytime soon anyway to a situation where you just send your kid outdoors and there will be plenty of opportunity to play. We're going to have to rely on settings that are kind of constructed settings where, because there's an adult there, it's safe enough that parents will feel, oh, it's okay for me to send my child there and for me not to be hanging around monitoring my child. It's okay for that to occur.
Thank you very much, Peter Gray. That was really, really interesting, and I think it will help so many parents, to feel free themselves, to let children play free. Thank you very much, Peter.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you for your interest and for having me.
Thank you for listening. We can find each other on social networks like Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook. See you soon.